It does get weird. Yeah, I guess stressful too sometimes, huh? That's funny. Never really thought of it that way. But yeah, I mean, I started meeting with a psychiatrist for the first time in my life not long ago,
Mm.
probably because this shit is so stressful and weird.
I think you're learning something about yourself right now.
Yeah, no doubt, man, no doubt. But yeah, it is. But what else is there too? Like I was just saying, there's few things that I'm this passionately interested in anymore. Because yeah, I said in my second book that I've always been easily bored with the banality of reality, and
Mm.
this challenges all aspects of reality, the way that we know it. And for a lot of people who aren't inclined to seek out questions because they don't have time or they don't want to or it's not interesting, but there's a lot of other people that are really drawn to this, many of whom haven't even had an experience or an experience that maybe they don't understand, that they're not fully aware of, and they want to get at that in some capacity, but many who just see the reality of this and are like, that's
Mm.
all it takes for me. That's enough to widen my aperture. Let's find out what else is out there that I don't understand and didn't even know was real until
Yeah.
recently. And I think that's a really cool aspect of this phenomenon.
Yeah. Now you were telling me off camera that you were approached a couple years ago
Mm.
by someone. You didn't say like what agency or what place, and I won't put words in your mouth or anything, but you were approached in a way that kind of shocked you based on what they said to you and what happened. Could you just explain what went on there?
Yeah, that's a beautiful segue too, considering what we're talking about and how sometimes we're forced to reconceptualize our reality. And a lot of times that takes ontological shock. We have to have a very a catalyst of some sort. And it's funny. I was just listening to an interview of Alicia Keys on Smartless coming over from the airport last
Mm.
night. And it was cool. She's talking about her creative process and how a lot of things that has written have come from heartbreak or death in
Yes.
the family or loss. And that's really the creative process that I think opens us up to this whole universe of emotions and energy and intelligence that exists all around us. Like Danny Sheehan was talking about, if we all are just little droplets of light, little fractal iterations of source consciousness that grows out of that infinite energy, it exists everywhere, all around us, in everything. And it's cool because, like, going back to what we were talking about with religion earlier, is I was always taught to look up to the heavens because that's where God is. But if you think about it, like if these different densities of energy and consciousness exist that everything's built from, it's actually inside. You would go
Mm.
in, like 0 point energy, for instance, or subquantum energy fields. That's likely where consciousness resides. I've heard Eric Davis say that. I've heard Hal Puthoff say that. Danny Sheehan was basically saying the same thing with these nodes of some sort of quantum, subquantum field. Um, but yeah, I think it's all related in some way. I don't know exactly how. And for the first time in a long time, I forgot your question.
It
I'm
was
usually
it
pretty
was
good at finding my way
it's
back, but I got
it's
lost
all
there,
it's
man.
all
I'm
good.
sorry.
I could see you were going down the road. I was asking about when you got
Yeah,
approached
yeah, okay,
by
okay.
someone and how that shocked you.
Right, right, right. So yeah, this was one of those times where I was forced to widen the aperture because I was done skis with all this. I was ready to jet. I was traveling a lot. I was, doing too much. And the stress of not just that, but the existential questions was weighing on me. And I decided I didn't want to do it anymore. And this was sort of their avenue in, whoever they are. Because that was just a thought in my head. I had just decided that about a week before I was going to a conference called the International UFO Congress in Phoenix, Arizona. This was October 7th or 8th, probably 2022. So about a little over 2 years ago. So I just had that thought, didn't tell my wife, didn't tell anybody, decided I'd go to this conference, I would give my talk, and that'd be it. I was working on this third book, so I decided I would finish that too. But that's a different pursuit. You can do that at home
Mhm.
whenever you want. It's not getting on a plane constantly. So I go down there, I give my talk, met this really interesting individual with a PhD who flew out to meet me to talk about his crazy ass experiences that he's been having, where he interacts with these beings who have indicated to him that they are from the future, and they have different capacities with which they can contact him and interact
How did
with
they
him.
indicate that to him?
He sees them constantly. He's able to interact through his dreams and also sometimes in physical form as well. They saved his life. He gave me permission to talk about it at this conference recently. They showed up one time at the edge of his bed and said, "You need to go see so and so doctor." And he was already kind of experiencing something and had a doctor where he lived in Southern California. They're like, "No, you need to go see this doctor," like an old friend of his that lived about 3 hours away. And he was like, "Oh, okay. Like, just I need to do this. I feel compelled to do this." Um, and he was being tested for cancer in a specific area in the place where he lived. They didn't find anything. They went 3 hours away to visit this one doctor. They did the same test and they found the cancer and
Whoa.
removed it and said, if we hadn't found this, you would have been dead in about 3 months. And it was
Whoa.
25 years ago. So they saved his life. And
Now, have they
that's
told him they're from the future? Have they
yeah.
like said
They've
that?
they've articulated. A lot of people have. That's what's crazy. A lot of these interactions, it's not just, "Hey, we're from outer space," or "Here's the star system." Even Betty Hill. I was telling Danny Jones about this because I just learned about it too. But even Betty Hill acknowledges that they're probably time travelers now because she described their physical form, had a bust made, showed it to some biological anthropologists. They said that's likely what we'll look like in tens of thousands of years. So anyway, I'm getting off track again.
That's okay.
You
You
need
went
to
to
get
this.
like a bullwhip or
You're
something and
good,
just
man.
track it if I keep going
I
down these
like these. I
little
like these little
roads.
tangents. I'm also the one asking the questions, getting you down there. So don't worry about it. But you were talking about going to the conference.
Yeah. So I was on my way to this conference in about a week or so. I'd already had a strange experience where I felt like I was having a telepathic conversation through a huge light, very overt light in my neighbor's yard, like a security light that sits up high. And I was just out there one night and I felt like I was having a back and forth conversation, which the next day I wrote off as just being a figment of my imagination, And of course, this is when people could argue, which I think is unjustified, that, we associate voices in your head with some sort of mental disability or schizophrenia or whatever, which I don't have. And I think everybody has some sort of intuitive connection to this broader consciousness that we are all aware of, but oftentimes, because of those stigmas, don't really pay attention to it much. Like the intuitions that we feel, the synchronicities that we experience, a lot of that is just trying to get us to pay attention to this much broader holistic reality that bridges the physical and the metaphysical. So I didn't take it seriously. I was still very in the physical reductionist materialist camp. I'd kind of been emerging from that. I had been to a conference at the Esalen Institute and have really, gotten to know a lot of people who study this and other phenomena like near death experiences, out of body experiences. And I take that seriously. Even though I haven't had one, I'm aware they exist and I'm interested in what people describe when they visit the other side. Um, but I wasn't there, and I sort of wrote it off the next morning as just whatever, even though it was a very real conversation. So I go to this conference, give my talk, meet with this guy who had his life saved by future humans, and then for some reason took like a 3-hour nap. I never take naps. Woke up late for this VIP thing where there's booze and there's schmoozing happening, and people can pay extra money to meet the speakers. And I was one of the speakers at this thing. Go to this Halloween party downstairs because it was right before Halloween in 2022. I'm out of money, and one of the participants, she runs audio video, name's Heidi. She doesn't mind me using her name. We've kind of all gone public with this in various ways. Is like, "Hey, I have a key to the VIP room. We'll go up and get some beers, bring them back down, and then you don't have to just go get money and pay $8 for a beer." So I'm like, "Cool." at this point, it's now clear to me that Heidi wasn't necessarily Heidi. She wasn't the one saying that or the one doing this, because we went up to this room, get the beers, shoved a couple in my pockets for my friends downstairs, and then I wasn't allowed to leave. And I'm like, what are we doing here? Why can't I leave? She's like, oh, my friend Eric wants to talk to you. I'm like, who the hell is Eric? She's like, oh, don't worry, you'll like him. And she just kept saying that over and over for like 15 or 20 minutes. And I'm losing my mind.
And
I'm
you're
like,
locked in this room.
I'm not locked in the room, but I couldn't leave. I wasn't, it kind of went beyond just, I'd like to wait for Eric. It was like a weird, just an inability to really conceptualize anything other than just staying there until Eric got there. Like I kept thinking about it. I would have that thought and I would say this and I would get frustrated, but I couldn't just be like, fuck this, I'm leaving. You know, maybe I could have. I don't know. That's a great question. I never really thought about it before in that capacity, but eventually I did just give up. Like there was something about that and the way she was saying it and how she was saying it.
Hypnotizing.
Almost, yeah. Yeah, almost. That's funny. I never thought about that aspect of it or even asked, why didn't I just leave? So anyway, I did eventually resign to the fact that I wasn't leaving, sat down in this chair, and then this Eric guy comes in, pulls up a chair right into me, like, you know, right with his knee in my crotch, like hits my crotch. And his face is right here, complete stranger. This Eric that we had been waiting for, who really wanted to talk to me, who I knew nothing about, and he knew nothing about me. He didn't know who I was. He pulls up this chair right here and says, we know you've been thinking about quitting lately, and we'd really prefer you not do that yet. And that was a very triggering event for me because
you never said anything.
I never said that out loud. There was a thought in my head that I just had while doing dishes. My wife was behind me, didn't even say anything to my wife. Not like she would know this complete stranger anyway and call him and be like, hey, he's thinking about quitting. You know, like just some dude.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. He wasn't really him either. He wasn't Eric in this moment. Like he was. And I've gotten to know him. And
yeah, what do you mean by that? You said the same thing about Heidi. She wasn't Heidi, and now he wasn't Eric.
Right. So at first, I didn't know what the fuck he was or who he was. All I knew is he knew my thoughts. And as the conversation unfolded, it was apparent that I was speaking to some sort of non-local consciousness that is aware of everything about me and also my future. And they were also the same non-local consciousness that I did in fact speak to through that light earlier that year. Because I asked a question, they allowed me to ask questions in this moment. And one of my questions was something I asked while talking to that light. And they said, we already spoke about that before you went to Rice University for this conference, which was right before I went to. And I was having anxiety about it. So I was like talking to this light about my anxiety and traveling and what I was doing. And that was supposed to be like apparently some sort of mediating exchange where I would feel better. But I wrote it off the next day. I didn't pay attention to it. Now they brought this dude with his knee in my crotch and his face right here and these really mesmerizing eyes to tell me to my face, because apparently I need that physical aspect of this, that we know what you're thinking. We prefer you not do that. I was allowed to ask questions. There was sort of a conversation. Slowly it shifted from being back and forth, vocalized conversation to purely telepathical.
Oh, you were going telepathic with him.
Yeah. Well, it happened so organically. I can't even identify the exact point when it happened. But,
so you could hear his thoughts without his mind.
And Heidi's too. At some point, we just stopped using our voices. But I could hear them and their voices in my head, and they could hear mine. I could hear my own as I was saying things telepathically. The first indication of that is when they said, we'd really prefer you not quit yet, I'd say, how could you know that? And they said, once you know who we are, you'll know how we know that. And then I thought, future humans, ? But I thought it telepathically, and they answered that before I said it. So that also is weird, that not only are this happening, that they know my thoughts, but I also communicated that telepathically, and they answered it before I said it out loud. Eventually, the whole conversation turned telepathic. So you've got these three people Eric sitting right in front of me, Heidi, who's to my left, um, just staring at each other, not saying anything. And people are starting to come in. There were these 3 women that came out because they were kind of concerned about me. They knew me and I knew them. And they came out, and this Eric, or whoever was communicating through Eric, said, "Can you close the door behind you?" All 3 of them turned at the exact same time, went in, closed the door. Nobody came out the rest of the evening. And things happened that we can get into.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So things happened and nobody else came out, but people were watching us. And there was some level of concern and like, what the fuck's going on out there? So what they eventually got to after the question answer session was that they came there to put 3 things in my brain that would be important for some future times. So again, some indication that they know the future and specifically mine, but also I get the sense it's for something else. I don't think it's just I'm going to be out walking my dog and then I suddenly say this thing. I have the sense that it's something possibly related to all of the things that are happening, but I have no idea because they told me before they did this. They asked my permission. It was all very nice. The whole experience was your classic love and light sort of thing, which again indicates that it's some sort of more evolved consciousness, I think. But they asked very politely. They told me I wouldn't have access to it. I wouldn't remember it, but I would see it coming in. And they would black my eyes out. And I would see this information coming in. And then they would release me from that. I'd go about my business. Do we have your permission? It was all very like a free will oriented. We need you to choose. Do you agree to this? So at this point, and this is where...
Did you feel like you could say no, though? Like
I did. I did. But I wouldn't have because what happened throughout the course of this vocalized and then telepathic conversation is I started to remember. I was made to or allowed to remember things in possibly a pre-incarnate state.
Pre-incarnate state.
Yeah. That I had been a part of before I came here in this body and walked across the river of forgetting.
And what did that look like?
I don't know, but I felt a familiarity and an awareness of something. And I'm sure this sounds absolutely insane, but it was the intuitive sense that I had that who I was interacting with through Heidi and Eric were entities, beings, intelligences, consciousnesses who were familiar to me. I knew them. And then I knew me and I knew our relationship. So I wouldn't have said no. I could have said no, but they had already brought me to the point where it's like, oh shit, yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay, let's do this thing. And so then I was actively engaged. I was a part of it. And what happened was exactly what they said. My eyes went black, like somebody pulling a curtain down over them from top to bottom. I see all of this information streaming in super fast. Like it was so intense. Like a fire hose is blasting you in the eyeballs. A bunch of color and like light, and it's swirling and it's moving. And apparently I could see the information at the time as it was passing through because occasionally Heidi telepathically, or no, I think she vocalized that. I can't remember. They became so confused. But I heard her in my mind or possibly in my ears, I don't know, say, did you get that? Did you get that one? Did you see that? And I'd be like, So I could see it. But then once it was in there, gone. There's no access to it at all. And they told me that, and I agreed to that. So that's fine. But it also kind of sucks because people are like, what'd they tell you? What'd they tell you? I don't know. And they told me I wouldn't know. And they asked if that was okay. And I said yes. So they finish up. I have no idea how much time passed. It was kind of a missing time thing, which makes sense because we were all kind of out of the bodies that register time. I kind of felt this as even before they put me in this sort of mesmerized hypnotic state. I kind of remember feeling like I was lifted above my body, like we were all kind of meeting in the crown chakra or something. To
In the
use
what?
the crown chakra. I'm using terms that maybe are relatable to people. You know, like you sort of lift it out, and we're just here. I could still hear their voice in my head. I could hear my voice in my head, but it kind of felt like I wasn't fully in my body the way I experience it every other time.
Yeah.
This was the only time that's ever happened.
Not that you're on it, but like kind of parallel to what some may say you get in psychedelic experiences a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And near death experiences of all
Mm.
sorts. There's this cool book, Impossibility of Things. Oh, I wish I could remember the name of it. Um, I'll text you later. Maybe you can put it in the show notes. But it's about a woman who was blown up by an IED in Iraq, and she was dead for a while. Her time had stopped. She entered this space, this time space that exists outside of the physical when we live our lives in. And she interacted with these beings who showed her all of these different pathways where her body could be put back together. And they were having fun with it. They were joking around.
Beings.
Yeah, these entities, these energetic forms that apparently exist all around us that we're not aware of because of our limited senses and how we can perceive the universe.
Did she say what they look like or how she perceived them?
Some are human-like. They were just energetic entities that could take on any form. You hear that a lot with these people that have these types of experiences, but they took on a form familiar to her, and she was allowed to work with them to put her body back together in all these different ways. And they would be like, okay, what if you didn't have a leg? What would your life look like? And they could instantly see her entire life with no leg. What if this eye that was hanging down from the side of her skull wasn't put back in and you lost that eye? And they were just messing around with her like she was a doll, and she was an active participant in this. And she was able to see, and they could just be like, boop, do that, and then that whole lifetime, what that looks like. So she didn't want to go back. She was like, physical reality sucks balls, and I don't want to be a part of that anymore. I don't think those are the words she used, but it's kind of like what I was feeling in a much smaller capacity. I didn't just get exploded in Iraq, but I was like, I'm just tired, and I kept saying that to them, and I felt like a giant wuss. And eventually I was like, man, I need to suck it up because this is small potatoes, how I feel in this thing. But she articulated that too. And then eventually was like, okay, I can go back. Let's try to make it a way I can go back. I need support. I can't just go back to the life I had. I don't want to, especially with all of these physical problems I'm going to have because I just got exploded. So they found like sort of a mutually agreed upon way that she could exist, and she got to be a part of it. And I've been reading a lot of channeled material lately because I now see that channeling is real. I never would have before this interaction, but that's essentially what was happening.
Channeling?
Yeah, so it's also known as a state of deep trance mediumship, where the physical form, the instrument, the body, is used for this information to come through. And that's exactly what this was. Like Eric and Heidi were there as physical beings, but their consciousness was being used to convey information and exchange information in this way. It's very much one way. They were just putting things into my brain. But we did have a dialogue for a while. I was allowed to ask questions in the same way that people do with this channeling material. So like the Seth material was one of the first ones. And then the raw contact, the law of one is a really interesting one, the Quo material. There's a lot of individuals who have channeled, and it's interesting because they're saying very similar things about what exists beyond this physical world. This is almost an illusion of sorts or a simulation, but that's not the right word. And we're here to have experiences, polarized experiences that can contribute to the evolution of the entire system. That this is a place where learning happens and suffering happens. And through that suffering, like we were talking about with Alicia Keys, things can come through and we can grow and we can learn. There's a lot of people singing her songs that come from that place that then build and grow, and the consciousness learns about itself from these existences. And this gets out there. This gets meta as shit, but it's real. And it's one of these things, like for someone to see a UFO and they're like, oh, wait, that's real. I want to figure out what that is. After this happened to me, I had to try to figure out what the fuck this is and what this physical existence is and how it relates to this broader awareness of a different thing outside this physical reality.
And to be clear, the guy, Eric, the guy you were talking to, if I understood that correctly, he's basically saying he's a future human.
No, not at all.
So I missed that.
That was my initial thought because they knew the future. They knew my future. So I assumed that individual and their consciousness was who knew that. Eric, I would not say he's a normal person. He's had a UFO encounter. His life, his mentality, his brain wiring has been changed. He was pinned down by a UFO and became a
Pinned
different
down.
person. Yeah, like held down by a UFO. There's a lot of instances of this happening actually in the UFO literature, where I wrote about one that Jacques Vallée wrote about in Passport to Magonia, I think, where this geologist was taken into UFO, stood in front of a computer for what he thought, was like an hour or so. Came back out and he was missing for 4 or 5 days. His dad was like the general of the army, so mounted this massive search. They couldn't find him. He had this little flower in his lapel, and he comes out. He's walking around. Eventually, somebody finds him. Like, dude, where were you? Where were you? The flower's perfectly the same. It wasn't wilted. He didn't have beard growth or anything. He was just in front of this computer, having this information exchange, similar to what happened with me, but inside of a craft. And then suddenly his sleep changed, which also happened to me. He knew things. He was already in college, and he just didn't really even have to go to class anymore. He just knew everything they were talking about. He would take math classes, and it was just intuitive. It was in there. So Eric sort of experienced that same sort of thing because I've gotten to know him. I was scared shitless to talk about this. It really fucked me
Oh,
up
so
for
you
a
still
while.
talk with him?
Yeah. It was actually the first time I ever talked about this publicly was with Jesse Michaels, because he was one of the first people I told about it. I was already doing something with him in December. This happened in mid-October, so it was still pretty fresh. And I was solidly fucked up for like 3 months. First 3 weeks, 4 weeks were really tough, but then even by the time I was hanging out with him in LA, it came up, and I needed to unload, and he's just looking at me like, what? And then he brought me back down about 6 or 7 months later, and I got the sense he would want to talk about it, because it's kind of a weird thing, and I think it has helped a lot of other people by talking about this, because I've found a lot of people have had similar experiences and don't know what to do with it, in the same way that I was struggling to attempt to fit it within my worldview box as well. So yeah, I was telling him about this, and when I first did, I didn't know what word to use for Eric because I didn't know what he was or who he was, and I assumed his consciousness, his body. I had no reason to think otherwise. And then I was sitting. His doco came out right before Thanksgiving, and I was sitting at the Thanksgiving table. We were about to eat, and he pops up on Facebook Messenger. He found me and sent me a message, and his face that came up, he still has his profile picture. You can go look at it if you want. It's hilarious. But it's all like mesmeric and like flowy colors, and it's right here, just like he was in my face when he's doing this thing. And it said, I think it's time for us to talk. That was his message to me. So already eerie ass picture, really cryptic message. I think it's time for us to talk. And it really triggered me hard. Like it sent me back to all those things I'd been coping with, that I did cope with, and that got better, but put me right back there.
Yeah.
Like, oh shit, he's real. He's a person, and I've got to know him. He is a person.
What is his background?
I don't really know a lot of details. A lot of things we talk about tend to be related to this. He's open about this. Heidi also willing to tell her story. I don't think she enjoys doing it as much, but Eric is really trying to help people. And he does have a fascinating backstory that I think really helps to conceptualize a lot of why he was there and how he was used and why he was used, because he does have abilities that I think stem from his UFO encounter that allowed him to shoot that information into my brain harder than most people could, and faster too, because there was a timetable. Like, there were people coming into this room. By the time they let me out, I mean, there's probably 15 or 20 people in there. I don't know. And I couldn't.
15, 20 people.
Yeah.
And
in
you've
this
been having
VIP
this
room.
telepathic conversation.
Outside on the porch, yeah. And it was crazy because I couldn't even lift my head to see. Like, as I walked through the room, somebody put their hand on my arm and said, "Are you okay?" Because again, there was, as I learned later, there was some concern about what was happening. I just go, Walked out of the room, down the hall. Fortunately, I was only about 5 doors down from that VIP room where this party was gathering. Laid back, slept for 13 hours, woke up, cried uncontrollably for like 4 or 5 hours. Went downstairs into the foyer to give a book to my friend John Dover. We were just in a George Knapp's doco together. I've known him for a while. Gave him my second book, and as I'm doing that, just bursting from the inside with all of this emotion and confusion and ontological shock,
Mm.
essentially, Eric comes around the corner. There's no reason for him to have been there at that time. Comes around the corner, puts his hand on my shoulder, and says, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Uh-huh, uh-huh." Like my brain was just mush, but it did take away a lot of that because I was on a panel that same day. I had to like function, the end of conference banquet was happening. There's a lot of stuff that I needed to exist in this physical reality for. And they, through him, in that moment, because they knew where I would be, happened to find a great space to catch me as I'm walking through and then help to alleviate a lot of that anguish that was associated with the shock of that event.
When it switched over, to go back to the event, when it switched over to telepathy, obviously, like, this goes on, as you said, for a little while, and it kind of naturally does it, and you can hear their thoughts and they can hear yours. Did it feel, I'm trying to think how I even want to ask this, but did it feel like you were delayed in understanding what was happening, or were you simultaneously understanding everything that's happening and also being like, holy shit, wow, we're talking to each other's brains right now?
Yeah, it was a progression for sure.
Mm.
It started out again vocalized, and then like I said, I didn't even really notice that it turned telepathic. But then eventually I did. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. But everything was already weird leading up to it from the very first thing they did, tell me they knew what was in my brain. But then, yeah, it was kind of this accelerating curve of the speed at which it happened and the understanding. And it was kind of like a remembering,
Yeah.
like I'm just and able to then take that awareness, get my own consciousness out of the way because I needed that to happen to put the stuff in it in the first place. So I did start to kind of remove my consciousness from this vessel, which allowed me greater clarity in the things that were said and a faster rate with which I could understand them.
Mm. All right, real quick, let's break, grab you some lunch, and then we'll come back and dig into this a little more.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, we're back. Actually, one thing we didn't get into before we took a break was what did your wife think of all this? Like, and how did that conversation go down where you told her about everything that happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the next morning, after I woke up with all my clothes on, my shoes on, my feet still on the floor, and was crying uncontrollably, which I think was kind of a physiological response to whatever it was they put in my brain. Because I didn't really feel like sadness or anything. It was just that I couldn't stop crying, and it was weird. And so I texted her, and I said, "I think I met them last night, and I can't stop crying." And she was like, "Happy tears?" I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I just can't stop, and it's driving me crazy.
I think I met future humans, and her first question is, "Happy tears?"
I mean, it's a fair question. Like, well, are you excited about this? And and I also didn't know. Like in my mind, it was future humans. I telepathically asked them that, but it's interesting, and I think important to point out that they didn't say yes in that moment.
Mm.
They just carried on. So it was like they said, once you know how we know that, you'll know who we are, essentially. And I thought future humans, and then they moved on. So the implication is that's who it is, but I get the sense that that's an oversimplification. Just to clarify that point. But yeah, no, so I was like, I don't even know where to start, because she's obviously like, what happened? What happened? And I couldn't call her because I had all this other shit I had to do for the rest of the conference. But when I got home, I told her the whole thing, start to finish, all the little details. And yeah, my kids were there too. And for a while, it was super weird because, I didn't talk about it a lot, but there were people I felt comfortable discussing it with because I'm trying to figure it out myself, and I still am. I don't know what the hell this is. But it did help talking to people, but their faces were always the same. It was kind of creepy, actually.
Mm.
There's just like kind of a blank stare. And
Might be because you can't possibly process something like that if you weren't there.
yeah, I think so. And I think that's a big part of it for me too. I'm still I've come to grips with the reality of it, but the implications I'm still working on. There was a period of time where that was really hard too, but it's gotten better. But yeah, I think the reason they did it the way they did was not just so I paid attention, having two people there, but also having the people inside helps for the reality of it for other people who weren't there.
Mm.
Because it's like, oh wait, there were witnesses to this. It was like we were in a little telepathy gallery or something. We're out on this
Right.
balcony, and there's a gaggle of people inside watching this with concern about what's going on. And so I think, that's helpful. Like when I talk about the conversation I feel like I had with that light that they referenced, it's just me and this light. There's nobody else there. Even if they were, they'd be like, why is this dude just staring at this light? But I think a big part of why it went down the way it did on that balcony with these two other people and with the people inside and with the three women that came out is so there's witnesses, essentially. Like, oh, that did happen. I saw this, interchange taking place.
You've done a lot of work in your research and in your books about reported experiencers, and we've already talked about it a little bit today. And essentially, what we're saying here is that you are one too through this experience in your own way. But how do you separate out what seems like I want to ask this correctly, but like what seems like people just piling on the train of I want to be able to say I was a part of something versus things that actually seem like they are plausible.
Yeah.
If we even know what plausible is in this kind of sense.
Right. Well, speaking personally, I didn't want to be a part of that at all. It was really hard for me to talk about this. It's gotten easier, but at first, and even it was a year later before I did finally talk about this publicly for the first time. And I think it's probably the same with most people. In fact, a part of why I did decide to share this experience publicly was what I told you off camera, that one of the questions I was allowed to ask, I asked, can I talk about this? And they specifically said, we want you to talk about this. But the other part is, you're right, in researching and writing my second book, I'm drawing from the experiences of people who are brave enough to talk about very odd experiences that most people don't believe. And I dedicated my book to them, to the brave women and men who were willing to do this, because we can't get information without it. So it was a combination of being compelled to talk about it because they told me, when I asked if I could, but also realizing I'm a hypocrite if I'm acknowledging these people who did and I'm not doing that. So yeah, but it's hard, and we do need discernment. We do need to absolutely take everything with a grain of salt and be critical. Does this person have a motive, or their intentions there that maybe are impure? I think we should be doing that with everything related to this phenomenon. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard because there's different levels. J. Allen Hynek, in his book, The UFO Experience, he took a lot of what he was doing in running Project Blue Book and tried to apply it to all of these different cases. He had this metric for strangeness and reliability. Reliability went up if there's other people involved. The strangeness had a higher score if it was outside of our conventional reality or what craft can do within our reference frame here in this time and space. And I think we can apply that to a lot of cases. And to really understand it, it seems that the stranger it is, the harder it is to believe. But that also maybe makes it easier to believe too. It was kind of a funny
What do you
scale.
mean?
Well, in the sense that it's easier to explain away with a lower score. Can be like, well, it moved and it didn't have lights quite right. But that's different than something coming down right in front of you and sucking you up into it and taking you away and
Yes.
gallivanting around the stars or whatever. So I think all of those toward the end of that spectrum are hard to believe based on conventional notions of what we have and what those things can do. But I think the big thing for me, and this is what I was trying to do with this second book, the extratempestrial model, is look for patterns across them. Can we identify recurring themes and patterns in each of these different cases? And then what can we learn from those? So I took, ironically, what's called an abductive approach, where you're looking at as much as you can. I know it's hilarious. But that is actually the name for this scientific methodological approach, where you look at everything, or as much as you can, with discernment in sampling. But then what you try to do is make inference to the best explanation. So I didn't come into this to prove that the extratempestrial model is correct. I wanted to look at a number of different cases that span 90 years over 5 different continents to see what emerges from that and what explanation may fit that data the best. And a lot of them, this time travel model does, but there's other ones too that can also fit the data. So I'm not trying to give priority to this specific model, but rather to take in this abductive approach to try to find inference to the best explanation. And that's one of them, but I think there's others as well.
Before we get to some of the other possible explanations, how did you whittle it down to 14 cases? Like what was the logic there and how did that happen?
Oh man, that's a tough one. Yeah. So largely what we do in anthropology is we look at things across space and through time. So I knew I wanted to have a broad view with regard to the same phenomenon and how it impacts people differently in different places. So within that, that's a starting point. And then within that, a lot of it was just an intuitive sense of how we can identify themes and patterns within and among them. So for instance, and it's hard because I did them in sequential order. So, for instance, the first case with Mike and Leo Dorshak in the Dakotas was in the 1930s. But there's elements of that also tie into some of the case studies later in the book that took place in the aughties and the teens. So it's kind of hard because you have to lay a foundation, but also link these themes together in the book through time, but also throughout these consecutive case studies. And it kind of came together in a way that makes me wonder how much agency I even had over that. Like how we were talking about Alicia Keys earlier and how she just kind of opens the portal to the Akashic record or whatever we want to call it. And I heard Paul Simon say a similar thing in a conversation with Stephen Colbert recently where he's like asking about his creative process. And eventually he's just like, in so many words, it kind of just comes. You connect and it comes through. And it's the same thing with, like, I've written probably 85, 90 songs. Most of them have just been something I poop out, like in that moment, You open up and there it is. If I try to write a song over the course of weeks or months, it's garbage, But one of my favorite songs, according to my bandmates and friends, was one of these that I probably wrote the entire thing, lyrics, melody, and music within an hour.
Isn't it so magical when that happens?
It's crazy. You feel so connected to everything.
Now, were you sitting down writing other things before you got to that song, or are you saying it happened within an hour where you literally sat down to write and just this song came out?
Oh, that's a good question too. I don't remember the exact way in that moment. I just remember it kind of pouring out. And yeah, it'd be interesting to know what catalyst existed, if there was some sort of thing that helped kind of unlock that pathway. Oh, I remember. I ate a half ounce of mushrooms. Just kidding. But that would probably do it, honestly.
It probably would. There's something about it though. There's this great explanation Ed Sheeran has where he shows a dirty faucet or a faucet with dirty water coming out. And then he shows another picture where the faucet now has clean water coming out.
Yeah.
And he's like, the idea that you get right to that without getting through this first part is very, very rare. Occasionally can happen where like just the right thing comes together in the right flow and you're like, whoa, what is that? I remember one time I was in a studio with some producers up here in North Jersey, the guys who work with like Fetty Wap and all those guys when they were blowing up. And I was in there for like a few different sessions, and every time it was like, they were working out different beats, like, no, it's not good. Oh, let's build on that, whatever. And then maybe the second or third time we were in there, like one night, literally sat down, and within like 5 minutes, I'm just sitting next to the producer, and he just starts with like this tone. And he's like, ooh, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
And then he's like, all right, and then he just hits something. We got real silent. Hits something else, boom, and then he flips over this table, adds in a little bass to it, and then comes over, puts some snares on. I'm like, and suddenly, I'm telling you, it was within 10 minutes. It was
Yeah.
completely together, and you had something that to this day I can't figure out why they didn't make that song. It's like,
Yeah.
oh my God, I can see that bumping in every club in America. And the thing is, it just doesn't work like that sometimes. It's sometimes like that little magic comes down and you can't control it. But when it does, you better ride that shit.
Absolutely. I think magic's a great word for it too, because it feels magical. And you know, to your question about how I selected these, Jeff Krapel, I think others have coined this phrase too, but a literary angel. You know, like how a book will just kind of come off the shelf or it's
Literary
sticking
angel.
out just a little bit, or you flip to this page that happens to be exactly what you need. That happens so much in that book. The first one, it took 7 years to write. A lot of research. There's over that one. That one was faster, much faster. My first book's called the Identified Flying Objects. I published it in 2019, and it's a really dense, thorough scientific investigation of this question. So that one focuses on this question specifically, draws from physics, astronomy, astrobiology, anthropology, and some of the other social sciences to some extent. But that one, it's been called dense by a lot of people. There's a lot of technical terms. I define all of them, but unless you like love science, it's not going to be something
Right.
that you would necessarily just read and be like, oh. So I wrote the second book that had a ton of literary angels in it, where I'm flipping through. I know I kind of want to write about this, but I don't know exactly how. Boom, there it is. I just flip to that page.
Whoa.
Or a book kind of just shows itself on the shelf. And then that one took about 2 years to write. And then this one definitely came from the ether, because I sat down, my truck was getting fixed at the Ford garage, and I went to this restaurant that was in parking distance with a couple notebooks, because I had an idea that I was going to write a fiction book, which I've never written prior to this point, and did some research on how to write fiction and, you know, the storylines, how they progress, just to have the framework. But then I sat down and I filled these notebooks in their entirety in the time it took between dropping off my truck and picking it up at this restaurant that I went to. And it felt like one of those things, you know, like writing a song or doing a painting, or the thing with the producer where it just kind of comes
Happens.
together, you know? And the entire framework was there for that book. And I'd modify things and I'd add it, but it's the same as it was that I scribbled in those notebooks. It's just one of those things where you like kind of just open
You
yourself.
see it.
And then let the magic happen.
Yep.
And that's how it was with the second book, the Extra Tempestural Model, where I'm like, I know what I want to write. If I try to force it, it's never going to happen. If I just kind of sit back and wait for those book angels to come down and help. You know, actually a really great example of this is Whitley Strieber. To come back to him in a very different capacity, one thing I learned, that this started happening to me after my contact experience, I started having time slips. My sleep was highly disrupted. I would always wake up between 3 and 5 a.m. and it used to drive me insane. I was like, what is happening? I need sleep. You know, I was busy at work and dealing with teenage angst, not my own, but my daughter's. I probably didn't need to clarify that, but my repressed teenage angst coming through in the wee hours of the morning. No, but life was just hard already. I was dealing with this contact experience. I didn't know what to make of it, and I was always up, and sometimes up for like an hour and a half. So I'm listening to Whitley on my friend Kelly Chase's podcast, UFO Rabbit Hole, and he's talking about how that happens to him too. And this conference I went to at Rice University, opening the Archives of the Impossible, that I went to right after my Talking to the Light experience, where I was sort of talking to the light as a sort of a way of seeking comfort in what was happening and all of the traveling and these insane intellectual conversations. At that conference, he was saying he gets up between 3 and 5 to meditate. And I was like, this dude's insane. Like he's setting an alarm, but it's not what happens. He's so tapped in to this other possibly all-encompassing reality that he has just woken up. And there's a name for it. It's called Brahma Muhurta. And it's existed throughout the world and through time, and they gave a name to it in the Hindu tradition. I think that's where it came from. Sounds very Hindu. Brahma Muhurta, where you wake up specifically at like an hour and 46 or hour and 45 minutes before sunrise. And I noticed it was changing too. So in the winter, it would be earlier. In the summer, it would be later. And it's completely linked to sunrise. But what I found is that when this happens, I was looking at it as this horrible thing that made me tired, and I was just grumpy the whole day, which doesn't work well with teenage angst, I'll point out.
No.
There was a lot of headbutting that was happening in my household at that point. But then, after listening to Whitley talk about it, and I got to tell him this story in Esalen and a group of other academics and researchers, after hearing what he does with it is that time there's a lot less interference because there's not a lot of people awake at that time in your general space and time, and you can actually have access to information and energy that you can draw into your body and into your mind during this Brahma Muhurta time that happens. So, and that was a switch for me. I started looking at it completely differently and started to meditate in that time and lay there and focus and draw energy and draw information and use it in a way that was empowering. So as opposed to a detriment, it became an asset. And I was suddenly energized. I had new things to think about, new ways of thinking about them. And it was something that was new following this new awareness, but also I feel like a change to the physiology of my brain too. Whatever happened on that balcony in Phoenix, I think changed something because I felt the physiological effects of that. My head felt heavy and I couldn't stop crying. And then, the things with the time and the wakefulness at this specific time, I really flipped the way I thought about it and started to use it as opposed to seeing it as a detriment.
Do you think that when something like that so heavy happens to you, obviously we're humans, we dwell on it because we're like, oh my God, you're questioning everything or whatever. But sometimes as you get farther away from something, the dwelling can get more stressful because you start to wonder, like, wait, did I feel this way about it? Did I feel that way about it? Did this happen? Like, you remember the story, but you're getting farther and farther away. So maybe it, like the ontological shock in a way, kind of increases more. Do you ever feel like there could be instances where, maybe some confirmation bias could come in some of your findings or things relative to you as it relates to this experience you had?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when all of this insane stuff started happening, and I feel bad even using the word insane because that helps perpetuate the bias and the way that we look at it, but these non-conventional things, which began as it did with most people in seeing UFOs. I finally did have a UFO encounter of my own from a distance, but it was clearly non-ordinary and it followed all of the same patterns as a normal UFO does in the nighttime sighting of that sort. But it was shortly thereafter that this wave of strange phenomena started to take place. And recognizing that, I wrote it down. So as it was happening, I wrote it all down so that I would have a pure, unbiased record of those events. I haven't gone back and read it, but it's possible that certain elements of it have been somewhat modified over time. And I absolutely do things now and study things now and look at things in a way I wouldn't without those. Some aspect of that could be biased in that I'm seeking out things that are related to that, not to know something. I'm not looking at it with a specific end in mind or a specific goal, but I've been opened up to new ways of thinking that lead me down a different path. But even in doing that, there's some bias inherent in it. So yeah, I think the problem would be if I was drawing conclusions and then working backward from it, which is the opposite of what I'm doing. I am trying to figure out what it is that happened to me personally. That's my starting point. But also recognizing that there's really no ego in it. It's really more of a quest to understand the world, the universe, the way we're all related, but without any sort of seeking to like confirm something for myself. Like in those moments, I was kind of brought into a space where I felt a collective unity that didn't really leave much space for ego. And that was one of the hardest parts, is that I came away from this experience with a very diminished sense of self.
Mm.
And it's been hard to get that back. I think that was part of the struggle. I went through another sort of dark period pretty recently, actually, about 2 or 3 months ago, where I was trying to get self back. I felt like I
You're
was being
trying to get
pulled apart.
self back.
Yeah, so I guess another way of saying this would be, so I recently became chair of my department, and that comes with a lot of work and a really strong focus on collaboration, working with others, doing this job that was hard for me to care about, because I had also gotten a foot in this other life.
Yeah.
And it was like my feet were in two different worlds being pulled apart, ripping me up from the bottom, like some sort of James Bond torture device or something. And that was really hard. That stress on my proverbial groin in this metaphor was really difficult. So and a lot of it I realized is because I need to be present in this body, in self, in these moments where I'm doing this job as a professor, as a chair, interacting with these things that seem so insignificant, because there's these bigger questions. Not that I have answers to those questions, but the seeking and the trying to understand takes you so far out and so far away from where that other foot is that you really do feel stretched apart. So I guess when I say I was seeking self again, or seeking a sense of ego, it was in trying to bridge that gap and understand that I am in this body and I am experiencing things, and I have to be a part of this world and be present for things, and can still ask questions that take me far away from there. I've heard Dean Radin talk about this, where a lot of people who have odd experiences that challenge their notions of reality erect a filter, and they can look through that filter. But if you get too far gone, and then it brings up questions of actual mental illnesses.
Yeah.
I just listened to a book about the telepathy tapes, and how kids with autism likely they have a different way of sensing. They can understand, speak telepathically. They can know things without even knowing themselves. That they didn't read a book, but if they know someone that is reading a book, they can just listen to the thoughts of that person and know what the entire
Download
book
it.
is about. Yeah.
Whoa.
So there's all of these ways of understanding, where we look at an autistic kid and say, oh, they're dancing around, they have no idea what's going on in reality. They might have a better sense of that, like what Danny Sheehan was talking about, where we might be evolving our consciousness to have that sense that we always had, and we erected these more physical senses that get in the way of that. And stuff like, obviously there's a scale there, and people can become dangerous, but if they're at the outskirts of this, if they have schizophrenia, they might have access to something that, instead of seen as a mental illness, we should see it as something that should be studied, because it might give us insights into different ways that the mind can work in different situations.
Yeah, I think sometimes I've said this before, but when you look at people who are a real genius at something, whatever it is, could be art, could be sports, could be science, anything. Like the creme de la creme, the best there are, there always seems to be some sort of, I don't want to use the word kryptonite, but like it's almost like they have a price that they pay for that genius.
Yeah.
Right? And so for their mind to be able to work this way, other things are just off. I'll give you an example. Kanye West. Kanye West says certifiably insane shit. Right? And sometimes it gets completely out of control. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to anyone else except him. But Kanye West is audio-visually probably the most genius person to ever walk this earth. He can create sounds and create imagery as well that other people can't even process how you would even get to that point.
Right.
And I kind of wonder if there is something, some sort of, wrong word to use here, but just for the sake of not being able to think of the right one, some sort of bastardization of the consciousness that has to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Neurodivergent people seem to have more abilities or different ways of thinking about things that give them insights. Even traumatic brain injuries. You know, you have
Yeah.
people that experienced a car crash and suddenly they can solve complex
Yes.
mathematical formulas. I know a woman personally, I met her in 2019, who was in a car crash, severe brain damage, and became, without having ever painted in her life, an amazing painter.
Whoa.
And I think that works both ways. Like we were talking about with musicians, you know, like music sort of changes your brain structure too. Psychedelics as well, you know, in any sort of way that you can sort of get in harmony with the cosmic existence that we're a part of. I think it works both ways. Like the music comes from that space, but the music and rewiring your brain to be able to do music with other people,
Yes.
especially, you know, because you're creating something together. And sometimes, you know, people are in different moods, you're not vibing. But then there's other times where you know exactly what everybody's playing and how they're playing it, and it just flows so beautifully. It's
What
kind of
is
like
that?
I don't know, but it happens with other stuff too, like those group mediumship things where, like maybe you've heard Leslie Kane talk about seeing this ectoplasm form into hands, and then she would take molds of these hands, like it actually comes into existence. But one person, spoon bending's another one. These what's it called? PK parties, psychokinesis, where people can bend spoons. It takes that group to be able to bring that energy that helps it happen,
Mm.
with the exception of select few, like not Ingo Swan. I always get him mixed. Uri Geller, like he can just do it.
Yeah.
But it takes usually that group energy that you see in the mediumship and, you know, spoon bending with music, art, creativity. But yeah, on an individual level, it almost seems like you have to be a little bit off. And maybe that just allows you to be more open in a way. You know, maybe it's not just a one-to-one correlation where it changes something in your brain, but just being more open and not seeing the world as everybody else does, like Kanye West. You know, he's like, fuck it, I'm gonna make what I make because it feels right to me, and
Yeah.
I'm not being put into this box that we're all supposed to work from, but I'm gonna look outside of that box. And that's essentially what a neurodivergent person is looking walking against the crowd of people walking toward them and seeing things differently.
Yeah, but it also like even beyond the people who are just geniuses, you know, we've done serious psychological studies. We've accessed all these things where people can study across psychologists can study across huge populations how people process things and think of things to get an idea of all the things in our brains that do tie us together.
Hmm.
But I still always say this because it is true. I've only ever lived between my two ears. And everyone else out there, if they think about it, well, that's the truth too.
Yeah,
And it's
absolutely.
like, what are these small microscopic things that could be just a little different, even if it's 0.1% in each of us, that make the whole, that like that in and of itself kind of hides the secret of what this consciousness is all about. You understand what I'm
Oh,
saying
I
there?
do. Yeah. I completely agree. And what would be the purpose if we were all the same and we all did the same thing
That's
and we all
right.
thought the same thing? It takes that polarity in order to do that. Good, bad, positive, negative, whatever we want to call it. But okay, so let's say hypothetically we are here because we are different iterations of source consciousness sent here to learn in order to contribute to the evolution of said consciousness. So the universe can learn about itself,
Yeah.
essentially. This came up recently in a conversation with my wife too, is and kind of harkening back to what we were talking about, is maybe there's things we just can't understand. Not because we, you know, don't ever think about it, we don't ask the right questions, we just can't. A big thing for me is, what is this relationship between this physical existence, which I think is secondary. I think it's an emergent phenomenon that grows out of primary consciousness. Um, and I'm in this body. That's all I have too, is how I perceive things that go in my eyes, that I touch and feel and can think about, limited by the time and space that I exist in, even outside of this body. But when this body exists, this thing I call Michael P. Masters, with his
You get
stupid
it
three
right.
names. but but this is my only frame of reference, but it's the frame of reference that I am a part of that can, you know, help in all of these different ways. But the thing that came up with my wife is, it's like, what would be the fucking point of knowing everything that exists in the land of remembering before we walk across the river of forgetting? What's the point? We wouldn't be here
Hmm.
if we had access to that. We wouldn't walk across the river of forgetting if it didn't serve some purpose. So, yeah, to your question of how is it all linked together, I think we all have to forget as we come into these bodies seeking knowledge, seeking information, seeking unity with each other, but realizing that we're all coming from a different viewpoint. We see the stimulus different, we see the catalyst differently, but we're still one, all giving back to the same thing. And that's not my idea. That's not an original idea. That's just from looking at all of these different things associated with what we're talking about, with consciousness and the universe. And
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here